Christine Volden is a sales and CRM evangelist and the owner of SoulfulSelling.com. She has over 15 years of experience in selling and managing sales teams and has created online sales training programs viewed by over 500,000 people. Christine helps small business owners and entrepreneurs build powerful sales teams and generate more revenue by using the quiet selling method. And she's here today to talk about a very underrated tool in closing sales, trusting your gut. With so much information flying at us on a daily basis, salespeople and business leaders can fall victim to a common trap, a surplus of data hindering our ability to act. In this Q&A session, Christine Volden will discuss why harnessing your intuition and focusing on your buyer's needs instead of your numbers will make you more likely to get your prospect to yes. Joined now by Nutshell's Head of Customer Experience, Catherine Mays. Please welcome Soulful Selling founder, Christine Volden.
Christine, hi, good afternoon. It's so great to be talking to you. How are you today?
Yeah, you too. Thanks.
Great. So before we dig into this topic, I have to know, what is the quiet selling method? What inspired it?
Yeah, thanks for asking that. So it was inspired. I worked for over 15 years in sales, and I noticed after kind of looking back on my career that I had really done things a little bit differently than a lot of other people. The focus was really on listening, which I think a lot of salespeople try to do, but they don't always do effectively. And so I really realized I had developed this own method. So it's fairly detailed, but it's really, it's using, your tools of listening and using your intuition to lead instead of kind of that aggressive pushing, which I think it also definitely has its place, but it's taking a little bit of a different approach.
Yeah, so what kind of sellers do you think benefit the most from quiet selling?
I think all sellers would benefit because sales really, and I'm sure people have heard this so many times, a great salesperson is listening more than talking. And that's really what it's about. But it's not just listening. It's like taking that information in and making the right analysis with it.
Yeah, as a naturally quiet person, that makes a lot of sense to me. So you've been a big advocate for trusting your intuition over your numbers. What exactly do you mean by intuition, and what does that mean in a sales context?
Yeah, sure. But let me just back up because I think numbers have a really, really important part in sales. That is, I would never say don't look at the numbers because that's so important. But I think, numbers tell a story and you need some kind of interpretation. And that's where I think trusting your gut or your intuition comes in. And what I mean by that really is using the power of your subconscious mind, which sounds kind of crazy, but people use the word gut, people use the word intuition. What you're really doing is depending on your subconscious, which is analyzing so many cues every day about the information. And when we have that gut feeling about something, that's really our subconscious talking. And there's been so many studies that show how powerful it is. It's like your subconscious is your supercomputer, and it's taking in all the visual cues, all the background, all that background information that you've taken in for so long. And it's analyzing it much, much more quickly than, what you think your brain is doing, or what you would call your brain.
Yeah, we definitely don't want to downplay the importance of numbers, and we all know that sales is a numbers game.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so these days we have all this data and all of these tools to help us enhance our conversations with our prospects. So how can you use your intuition or your gut to better analyze your numbers or guide you in your decision making?
Yeah, great question. Because, a CRM tool is that's the most valuable part of it, I think, is that you get all of this data. And one of the downsides, especially for people who are fairly new to CRM, who just love numbers, is they get so lost in the data and they try to use that to analyze everything. And they just kind of spend all their time thinking this is going to give me the answers. And while it does give you tons of information, you have to trust yourself to figure out what answers you need, right? You need actionable information. You don't need a bunch of numbers to tell a story that you can't do anything with. So when I say to use your intuition in that, it's really to make quicker decisions. So it's what do I need this data for? If this data seems off for some reason, or I just have this gut feeling there's something different, it's trusting that and saying okay, let me dig into this a little bit more. So it's really kind of trusting those gut feelings that you have some thought about and using the data to look at that and to analyze that But also, I always think to really be able to make quicker decisions.
Yeah. So kind of picking out the most important pieces and focusing on that.
Absolutely.
Cool. So what is the tangible benefit to harnessing your intuition? Or more specifically, how can trusting your gut help you close a deal?
Yeah, and I think the biggest thing is speed to making decisions. I think that's it. I think so many times, especially with like really big teams, and I've seen this in large companies I work with, you have so many different decision makers and stakeholders, and you're trying to analyze each one and what to do. And sometimes you're like in that planning mode for so long that you're not moving the deal forward, right? And like the ultimate goal is to close this deal and have success, right? So I think by the tangible benefit is really if you can get there quicker, then that is a huge win for everyone, right? That's a huge win for your customer. That's a win for you. That's a win for everyone. And that's why I think like if you can tap into that, like a gut feeling and realize that is as valuable as the data that you're seeing from your numbers and trusting that, that's going to bring you so much more quickly to the sales and to the close.
Got it. So does trusting your gut apply to any other areas of sales? How could you leverage that in other stages of your buying process?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it really applies to like everything in life, right? Anytime we have to make a decision, because what I've noticed, especially like in the tech world where I've worked for many years, people get stuck in this, I call it this swirl of their brain where they're like, I don't know what to do next. I work with a lot of startup founders and a lot of small business owners, and they really a lot of times are getting stuck. And then what I see happening is them over analyzing information and thinking like, if I think about this harder or more, I'm going to come to a decision. And that's really not what happens. And that's why so many people will tell you like, take a minute, take a break, right? Go for a walk, go for a run. Just get out of thinking about that problem for a moment so you can allow like all that information to sink in so you can make a decision that's like more based on like all of the information than something that you're worried about or you're stressed or you're like, worrying so much about having a specific outcome. So I think it really applies to any decisions you're making in life, especially if you work in a situation where you're dealing with a lot of stress and overwhelm. I think it really helps in every situation.
Yeah, of course. So as a sales professional, how can I practice trusting my gut? Or say if I were a sales manager, how could I help instill that concept in my team?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple ways, and I did create a quick website where you could find, or a quick web page that just has like 3 really, really simple tips. And basically, it's really getting out of your head and like just taking a break for a minute. And I kind of walk through these really 3 simple steps. If you go to my website, and I think we have the URL, it's soulfulselling.com/nutshell. And it's really going through these steps where I always say like to do something physical or get out of your head. So like go for that run, go for a walk, even do, sit in a chair and just notice, how your feet feel on the floor, right? Like stop thinking about like this issue very quickly or just for a couple moments so that you can let the information sink in and you can allow your subconscious or your intuition to kind of play a role in it. And then I think, it really does take practice like anything else. Like sales is all about practice. The more you talk to people, the more you make offers, the more comfortable you become with it. This is very much the same thing as just like, a lot of times I notice that especially in technology companies, people are saying like, okay, you can make that decision, but I need the data to back it up. And in some ways that really discounts that gut feeling that especially I think so many salespeople have because they're on the front line, right? And they are talking to all of the customers and they are getting all of this information, even if it's at a conference, they're seeing the way people react to the offers that are being made and they see all of this information and they're taking all this in. And so they know if something's like not hitting right or if like the product, maybe the pricing is off or if there's something wrong, they're going to have a feeling about it. And so I think as managers, like listening to that and realizing like there might not be data on something like that. There might not be data on the fact that everyone was lukewarm at an event when they made a specific offer, right? And you can talk about it, or you can just say, like, I just noticed like 3 or 4 customers like always asked about this part of it, and they seem really worried about this. It's like that information is as valid as your, CRM numbers. So I think as managers and as salespeople, understanding like that information, like a hunch or a gut, it doesn't come from nowhere. It actually comes from the power of your subconscious analyzing all of this information. And I think a lot of people think like, oh, it's just like, my feeling isn't valid, but it actually is, because it's a different part of your brain. So I think that's the biggest part, is just kind of trusting that and giving, value to that information or those thoughts that people have.
Yeah, that's great to hear you say that. I know I personally have experienced times when I have not trusted my gut, and you realize, right away, you're like, oh, I knew that I should have done it this way.
Exactly. And everyone has a story like that. And so I would encourage you to think about the times when you like had this feeling, you're like, I knew I shouldn't have done that, right? That is a very powerful feeling. And when we discount that, then we talk ourselves out of it. And that's what often happens in a world where we have so much great technology and so much information. It is really valuable, but like our brains and our supercomputers are actually more powerful than like all of the man-made computers out there.
Yeah. Okay, so you've said that selling is 20% numbers and 80% confidence. I was wondering if you could share some tips for building up your confidence as a seller, or maybe some strategies you can follow to form new habits, things our attendees could try out.
Yeah. So when I say 20%, I always say that's like the business of sales, right? That's like following the sales funnel, knowing like, you have to create interest and make an offer and make a close, right? And that is absolutely valid. But you could have all of that information, and if you don't believe in yourself or in the product you're selling, it's always going to be more challenging. So I always say the number one way to build your confidence is practice. Right? I remember being a brand new salesperson and just being so nervous talking to people. And I was with all these other experienced salespeople in a room, and they could all hear me like pitching the offer on the phone. And I just remember being incredibly like terrified. And I would go and practice in the bathroom mirror. And I would come back and I would still be worried. And that lasted about 2 weeks. But anyone, who works in full-time sales knows that like you have to make those like 20 calls a day, 30 calls a day sometimes, to really get into the groove of things. And once you start practicing over and over again, it becomes so much more comfortable. So I think that's really one of the cornerstones. The second one I say is knowledge. So knowledge is just knowledge of your product, knowledge of your competitors, knowledge of, just your company and what it has to offer. A lot of times salespeople are so focused on like, okay, here's my script or here's my product, I just want to go out and sell it. And they don't learn that much maybe about the industry that they're working in or their competitors and what they're offering. So I think like knowledge and practice are like one of the 2 most important things. And then I always say like, it just creates this reinforcement, because the more you learn and the more you practice, like it just reinforces itself. So really those 2 things are so helpful, especially for like small business owners. The practice part, when they hear like, hey, if you work at, a full-time sales job, you're going to be making 20, 30 calls a day. They're kind of in shock, because I'll say like, how many calls have you made this week? And they might say, well, 5. I'm like, okay, you're in like the first hour of day 1. Like do 100 calls and come back and tell me how you feel. So it is important to know, like when we say practice, it's not doing 10 calls. It's like really doing 20 calls a day for a couple weeks to really get in the groove and feel it.
Yeah, it seems like that's really great advice, especially for people just starting out in sales. You have to kind of build up that base so that when your gut is telling you something, that it knows what it's talking about.
Right, absolutely, yeah.
Cool. Okay, so since today is all about going above and beyond for your buyers, what's something that you like to do in a sales scenario to exceed your buyers' expectations?
Oh, that's a great question. I really like to ask them like big picture how they visualize success, right? And a lot of that in sales, and I think experienced salespeople know this, it's about managing expectations of your buyer, right? Like what are they expecting? So I like to know, first of all, like how are they going to measure the success of this specific purchase or buy or whatever it is, but not just what they expect, but like what would their like ultimate be? Like, how could I blow them away? How would they feel like, oh my God, this was like, I would never make a different choice other than working with Christine and her company. So I like to ask them that because I really want to always exceed expectations. I always say like, undersell and over deliver. So I believe that, but I don't believe that, some people think like, well, okay, I'm going to just give promise them a little bit and give them, what they want. But I like to know like, what would because every buyer is different. So I'd like to know like what would be like the ultimate for them. Even if I couldn't provide them that, at least knowing that in my mind, I could think of like, how could I set them up for success to get there? So I think, talking to buyers about that and what they visualize, and sometimes they won't even give you a direct answer. Sometimes you really have to ask them, well, what else? Like, what else would you want? Because they might not even think that it's possible. So I think that's what I typically try to do.
Cool. So I'm curious if you have any suggestions, if you are trying to go above and beyond, maybe setting a little bit less of the expectation than you can deliver. Do you have any stories or examples on how you've used your intuition or trusted your gut to really exceed like what they thought was going to work out like in the end?
Yeah, I mean, I can think of, and I was thinking about this this morning. I think, a lot of it, and I'm trying to think of a specific example, but one thing I often do is I really try to visualize like really big success for my clients and for my own company. So many people know like top performing athletes often do this. They'll do like visualizations, right? And they'll visualize like shooting a goal or winning a game or like doing specific things. And there's a reason why they do that again and again. Part of that is to build up confidence for sure. So we talked about confidence before, and visualization is a great tool for that. But also it actually trains your subconscious to get more accustomed to success and kind of like to even expect success, right? So as from a sales perspective, really just not just thinking like, am I going to get this deal or being worried about this deal, but like expecting to get that. I think is just kind of a mindset shift that really helps people. But I can't think of a specific example, but it is really interesting that this year my business has like completely shifted and taken off just partially because I feel like I stopped controlling everything. I stopped worrying about like, should I do this or should I do this or I have to do this, because I work with so many different types of companies. And it's been really interesting when I just have been focused on the main goal of really, hey, I want to expose this work to so many more people that I've had people reach out to me to do radio shows, to do TV interviews, to do podcast things like this one. And that's been super interesting because instead of thinking of the specific goals myself, of hey, I want to do a podcast this year, I've just said like, hey, I want to expose this to as many people as possible. And by doing that, I think I opened up the possibilities for so many things I hadn't even thought of. So that's like been an interesting experience for me personally, as someone who teaches this to entrepreneurs and small business owners, that I see it apply to my own work all the time.
That's great. So we have a couple of audience questions I'd like to throw in. We have a question from Heather. How do you build up trusting your gut more and more? You've talked a bit about visualization and kind of feeling your way through, but how do you practice building that up over time?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard in the beginning. I'll admit, sometimes it's hard because you'll have this like gut feeling and it might be really like at odds with what you thought you were going to do. And I've had that. And so I would say like in the beginning, you just have to trust it and notice. One thing I notice about like people in general is we always tend to remember the somewhat negative, like, failures we've had or disappointments, but we don't always remember the positive things. So I would say like it doesn't have to be a journal, but keep like a page on your phone or like a notebook that just reminds you like, hey, I had a feeling about this in my intuition. And check, it was true. And just keeping track of those things, because once you just start noticing and consciously paying attention to that, you'll notice how many times that comes up. And don't just notice it in work situations, notice it in personal situations too. Like everything from, oh, I decided to drive this way to work today instead of that way. And then maybe you heard like, oh, there were like all these accidents or something, like even little things you'll just notice again and again. It really builds up. So I would say notice and pay attention and practice.
Awesome. That's really great advice. Another question from Mary Claire. How much do you think personality plays into selling?
I think it plays in a lot, but I don't think there's any personality that's like a detriment. Like I'm an introvert, I'm a very quiet person. And I used to really change who I was in my very early days of sales. I would really try to be like what I thought the stereotypical salesperson was like, very outgoing, not necessarily pushy, because that's not my style. But what I noticed is that when I tried to be someone I wasn't, I didn't come across as authentic, and I lost trust with the people I was selling to. So I don't think that there's any, and I've written articles about this that are somewhat controversial about why introverts, I think, are the best salespeople, because they read, nonverbal cues. They're great listeners. They're great at connecting one-on-one. And those are really all the tools to be a strong salesperson. Now, of course, I think there's extroverts who are fantastic salespeople too. But I don't think personality has to, there doesn't have to be a specific type of personality. I think the important part is that you own who you are, because that's going to be what comes across as most authentic. And that's the way to connect and build trust, because that's really the foundation of selling. Even if you're selling like, a SaaS tool and like you're doing very little interaction, there's still a level of trust that has to be had in the company. And if you're that first contact, that's super important. So I'd say whatever your personality is fine. Just like be true to that and, work to your strengths. As an introvert, I used to sell advertising, and my colleagues would do these huge like wine and dine events and bring like 20 people to a concert. And that was like my worst nightmare. So I would just adapt what I did. And instead of doing that, I would find the 2 decision makers and bring them out to dinner and meet with them, because I was great one-on-one. So it's like adapt to what your style is, and just work with that.
Yeah, that brings to mind a really great point too, which is that your buyers are also going to be trusting their gut, and if you're not being authentic and genuine, they're probably going to pick up on that, and
absolutely,
that could destroy the
100%.
relationship.
Yeah.
Cool. Another question: if you are working for maybe a very data-driven organization, or your boss is very numbers-driven, what's a way that you can advocate for yourself if you are trusting your gut when you're being told to trust your numbers instead?
Yeah, I find that people who are super focused on that love to read like the science behind this. And that's why I bring it up. And that's why sometimes I say, well, it's the subconscious. There's so much data written out there. So like Malcolm Gladwell wrote a book called Blink, and it's about the power of your subconscious, and he has all these great stories. So for someone who's very data driven, like give them the data on this. This is why your subconscious plays in. And it's going to be a little bit tricky, like someone who's so data focused, usually like that data makes them feel safe and tells a story, right? But somebody has to interpret that data, and that data is always based on specific assumptions that someone had to make somewhere. So kind of like pointing that out. And of course, that's a little tricky when it's your superior, but, just like making baby steps towards that. So if that's, even, like in a very small, like team building event, bringing stuff like this up and just opening up the conversation to it, and looking at, the data and the science behind kind of the power of our subconscious, I think is really helpful. That's all I can recommend. And then you can, if you can't do anything, you can just try to use it for yourself in situations where you have the ability to do that.
Yeah, great advice. Thank you. So another question I have from the audience, from Vanessa, is asking a buyer what they want something that it's okay to ask directly?
Oh, absolutely. And I find a lot of new salespeople do worry about asking these questions. But the more you have to realize you are providing a service that solves a problem for someone, right? And everyone in this day and age is super busy, and being an efficient salesperson and really mindful of your customer's time, I think is super important. So instead of trying to guess, just put yourself in the customer's shoes. Would you want, a salesperson to guess, hey, this is what you want, instead of someone who directly asked you? I mean, when I think about that, I'd much more say hey, I would love it if you would just ask not only what my expectations are, what are my pricing boundaries, what are things that are important or absolutely cannot happen. Ask all of those questions, because the more questions you ask, the more likely you're going to get to the sale more quickly. And that person's going to be really happy that you were able to have that direct conversation. For people who kind of worry about that, and I remember I had this insight very early in sales. I realized, well, people have this budget and it's allocated for whatever this is, right? In most cases, sometimes you have a product and it's like, you don't know what budget it fits in, but in more or less you have. I know I sold advertising. People had an advertising budget. So I was like, it is not personal. It is not like about me. It's like they actually have to spend the money. That is their job, is to spend the money. So who are they going to spend it with? I know my product is good. I don't know if it's the best. I think it's pretty good. I know I take care of my customers. So that's important too. So I'm like, well, they might as well spend it with me because they have to spend it. I mean, that's their job. So let me just make sure that I can like deliver it in the way that, you know, it works for them.
Awesome. Another thing I'm curious about is if you have any favorite anecdotes about a time that you trusted your intuition, maybe even over numbers or data that you had in a way that worked out successfully for you.
Yeah, I mean, very recently, I would say last year, I made a big decision about pricing because I used to price some of my like I have a variety of online courses where I teach salespeople different tools. I also work with LinkedIn and provide some training to some of the people there. And I really kept having this feeling like I should be charging much more. And it was like a considerable amount more. Like, I think it was like 4 times what I was currently charging. And I kept thinking like, I don't know if that's a good idea. And I just started thinking about it. And it was really interesting and kind of testing it out with people I talked to. And like, I would say like immediately within the first month, I had 2 people pay that amount. And I realized, and this is so interesting for entrepreneurs, I just realized I had a mental block around this pricing. I kept thinking like, oh, I don't think it's valuable enough. And I needed other people to tell me, no, like I'm totally willing to pay this to build up my confidence. So that was like a great example. And I was very hesitant to trust myself in that situation because I was like, this is a big leap. And I really try to make my trainings accessible to as many people as possible. So I was very hesitant. But I was like, well, let me just try it because I keep having this feeling like there's other people that I could work with. And it was a great success. And I worked with not only people that I really enjoyed, but because they were making that investment. And I always say like time and money are representations of your priorities. The people that I worked with took this work so seriously that they really exceeded all of my expectations.
That's wonderful. That's a great story. Thank you.
Yeah.
Another question that I have, which is from Julia, who is watching live today. If your product is very complex or maybe a very data-driven product and most of your interactions are happening over the phone, say you're selling over the phone, what's a way that you can kind of bring your intuition and your confidence into those conversations?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. And I sold very complex like advertising tools for a long time. I sold like tools that did programmatic sales. So I do understand how complicated that is. I would say there's always room for personal interaction. If that's like in the very beginning of the conversation and you're making small talk, or just like having like more in-depth conversations about like the people in the company, because what happens is we get so focused on the product, we forget there's people using it and the people have different personalities. So sometimes there's like a great product and the people using it are using it the wrong way. And that's maybe why it's not successful. So I would make sure, like, even with a very technical product and even if you're doing a demo or you're explaining it, kind of finding out a little bit more about the personalities of the people who are using it and asking those questions, because that always opens up, you know, a lot of information. Like it's a very big difference if an engineering team is using a product than a sales team, right? It's typically very different personalities. So just asking like a bunch of questions, asking open-ended questions and kind of hearing the answer to that, you know, and just following your gut on where that conversation even leads. So using your own intuition about like what questions to ask in these conversations. So, you know, start very simple. You know, I always ask people where they're located in the world, because I am very lucky to be in California. Some people are in very cold places, like I think you are right now. So I always ask kind of what's going on in their area.
Cool. Yeah, that was going to be my next question for you, is if you have any favorite kind of conversation starters But that's a good one, location. Do you have any others that you would suggest, especially if you feel like your personality isn't quite in line with the person you're selling to? How do you kind of open that up?
Yeah. I mean, it really depends. I have kids, so like, anyone who has kids, like, always wants to talk about their kids, hands down. But I know a lot of people don't have kids. I know a lot of people ask me about sports, and I am not a big sports fan. So if someone asked me about something, I'd be like, I don't know. I can't answer that. So, I mean, it doesn't hurt to look at someone's LinkedIn profile before you start, and just hearing a little bit about them. And asking where they're from. I grew up in New Jersey. For some reason, I always meet people who grew up in New Jersey or lived in New Jersey or know someone's from New Jersey. I think that's a weird New Jersey thing. I don't know what it is. But yeah, I mean, it's I'm not a huge fan of small talk, and I've talked about this many times. It's kind of drives me crazy, but there is something about building rapport with someone, right? So that's why I really think, something like this, a video conference call is always going to be more powerful than a regular phone call. Of course, meeting someone in person is always the most valuable, but if you can get someone on the phone and see them and have a little conversation, I think that goes a long way. And then, just whatever your personal interests are, talking about those.
Yeah, I love that. I think opening up personally gives the people you're around the opportunity to do the same. Like, for example, my dad is also from New Jersey, now lives in Michigan.
See?
And
exactly.
Now we have that in common. So that's great.
Always.
Yes. Okay. Well, I think that's all that I have for today, but if you have any final thoughts that you would like to share with our audience, or if you would like to direct them to where they can go to learn more about the quiet selling method or soulful selling, where should they go?
Yeah, absolutely. So I did create this guide, and I'll tell you really quickly what's on the guide, and it's soulfulselling.com/nutshell. It's totally free. It's just a web page I created, and it has these 3 tips to tapping into your subconscious, and I'll just tell you super quick what they are, and you can read them. But number 1, it's to get quiet and breathe. And I just want to say, a lot of people are okay, well, that's everybody does that. But this is the most important part. So do not ignore it. And I say that as someone who used to ignore that. That's why I think it's so important. Number 2 is to kind of just tap into your other senses, right? Tap into you. And that's why I say go for a run, go for a walk in nature, go outside. If you live in a very cold place, go play in the snow for 10 minutes. Do whatever you need to do to get out of your head, right? Because that is what needs a break, right? If you're overthinking and you're swirling, that's what happens. And then I say to visualize that you actually know the answer to the problem that you're struggling with. Just assume, you don't need to know what the answer is. Just be what would it feel like if I absolutely knew what to do? And just feeling how that feels in your body, most likely you're going to really relax. Your shoulders will probably drop, your chest might drop, and just feeling that feeling. And doing that for anywhere from 10 minutes to 30 minutes, and then go back and see how you feel about the issue of whatever it is. And this could be anything. It can be a personal issue. It can be a work issue. I tend to think people get really wound up when it's a combination of those, right? There's something going on personally. There's something really stressful at work. It's a great way to kind of manage all of that. And then it's just test it. In the beginning, we don't always trust it. But the more you trust it, it's just like a muscle. The more it's going to feel very comfortable for you. And you're going to notice hey, when I make a decision, it's going to feel so much more solid. So if you go to that page, you will see an area where you can sign up for my free trainings. I actually have a training on this coming up next week. So you can sign up on that page if you'd like, or just to get updates on events and webinars that I'm doing that are coming up.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Christine. It's been an absolute pleasure speaking with you today.
Yeah, you too.
Yeah, so that's all I have. We'll drop that link in our chat for all of our viewers, and I hope you enjoy the sunny California weather.
Yeah, thank you so much. Take care.
All right, you too.
Okay, bye.